Welcome to Passion for Sound, the channel dedicated to thorough and honest reviews of headphones, earphones, DACs, headphone amps, other components and accessories. Basically everything audio related except power amps and passive speakers. My name's Lachlan and my goal is to explore and discuss all kinds of audio topics, even the controversial ones, to help us all find more enjoyment from music. Thanks for watching and enjoy the video. Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review, and today something a little bit different with a look at a bunch of different op amps. Now just in case you're not familiar with what op amps are, I'm going to start off with a quick explanation of what they are, what they do, what they normally look like, and then the difference with the ones I'm actually talking about in this roundup review. The first thing you need to know about op amps is that op amp stands for operational amplifier, meaning that it's essentially the part of your amp that does the amplification of the signal. There's lots of different amps on the market that use an op amp style design, things like the Shit Heresy, the IE Magni, the topping range, whether it's an L30, an L50, an A90, all of those use op amp style designs. And in most cases when we're talking about op amps, we're talking about these tiny little integrated chip style devices. So they've got 8 pins and then everything else is going on inside the chip. The alternative to these normally is what's known as a discrete amplifier, something like a Singer SA1. And in that case, there's no such thing as these little chips in there for an amplification purpose at least, and instead it uses capacitors, resistors, transistors, all individual components to amplify the sound. The benefit of op amps like this is they're compact, they're cheap to produce, and they're able to measure very well. But that doesn't always equate to the best possible sound quality. And so there's also a third class of amplification coming in the form of discrete op amps, and that's what's used by amplifiers like the Burson Soloist 3XP here, the Burson Soloist GT, the Sparkos Labs Aries. There's a few floating around that use what's called discrete op amps. And the idea there is that instead of boiling all of those individual components down into a tiny little silicon chip, which has its own set of compromises, instead what they do is that they build it onto a set of little PC boards like this one. This is a Sparkos Labs op amp, and so it's a discrete design but in the more compact size of something like an op amp, and most importantly, with this sort of design, they're generally easily swappable. And what that means is you can tweak and tailor the sound of the amplifier to suit your tastes. And so just to put everything into context, before we do a deep dive on these op amps I've got here, we've got 3 types of amp. You've got your integrated op amp style design like these, which are sometimes swappable. They're not always swappable. Sometimes it's an even smaller chip, which is what's called a surface mount device, where it's tiny and it's soldered directly onto the board without these sort of plug-in pins. Then you've got your discrete op amps like what I have here. And then you've got your fully discrete designs. These are also fully discrete, but what I mean is when I say fully discrete design, you've got a design which is all built into place on a circuit board like a Singer SA1, and those designs don't have swappable op amps. And so what we're looking at today are 3 different op amps that are all fairly similarly priced. You'll generally find that most discrete design op amps like these will range somewhere in the realm of $50 to $100. We've got 3 different options to look at today in the Burson V6 Vivid here in red, the Sparkos Labs SS3602, which is identical to the 3601, only it's the dual version instead of the single version, and I'll talk about that in a second. And then we've got the Staccato op amp. They've got multiple versions of these. They're all the same design, just in different configurations with the heat sinks, and we'll talk about that shortly too. I mentioned a moment ago though that the SS3602 is a dual op amp, and that's something you need to be aware of if you're buying op amps, is whether or not you need dual or single designs. All of these here in front of me are dual op amps, meaning that they take 2 channels of input and output of the signal. There are other designs though that require a single or a mono op amp, which will handle just 1 channel. So if you had a stereo amplifier, simple single-ended setup for instance, you would need 2 single op amps, so mono style op amps, or 1 dual, left and right. In this case, because I've tested, and I'm going to be talking about these in the context of the Burson Soloist 3XP, which is balanced, and also the Composer, which is balanced, that's the DAC from Burson. In this case, they're all dual op amps, but do beware, you need to find out if you want a single or a dual op amp for your particular device. If you're having trouble working out which type of op amp you need, it's generally best to have a look at what's already in your device. If it doesn't tell you clearly on that op amp what it is, whether it's single or dual, then often the manufacturers of these will be able to help you out if you email them and tell them which op amp you're looking to replace. Whilst I'm always happy to try to answer any questions and help out where I can on the channel, I can't always promise that I'm going to know every single op amp and what you need to replace it with. Whereas the manufacturers are generally very well versed in this. And so without further delay, let's start talking about the Burson V6 Vivid, the Sparkos Labs SS3602 and the Staccato op amp. And I want to say a huge thanks. I don't recall which viewer it was, but it was a viewer that put me onto the Staccatos. Staccato have been kind enough to send me these to review, and they're a really nice op amp, as I'll talk about soon. The V6 Vivids and indeed the V6 Classics, which I'm not reviewing here because I don't have a dual set of Classics, these are designed in a very simple vertical kind of rectangular prism form. On the bottom we've got the 8 pins that connect into the socket on your circuit board, and then you've got just a very simple plastic housing. Inside that there are a couple of circuit boards and all of the individual componentry that makes up a discrete op amp like this. One of the things that's great about the Bursons is they've got a very narrow footprint, so they can often fit into quite compact spaces. But you do need to be aware of the vertical height of them, as some devices, particularly mobile devices, won't have the vertical space available. The final thing to point out, and this is true for all op amps, is that every op amp has to be oriented the correct way into the socket you're plugging it into. The sockets themselves will have a cutout at one end, and so you always need to work out which end of the op amp has to face the cutout of the socket. For the Bursons, they've mirrored the cutout actually all the way down the side of the housing. So when you look at the housing, there's a groove on one side, you point that groove to the same end as the cutout on the socket. So Burson have made it really nice and simple there. If we take the Burson as kind of the baseline, and I don't mean that as saying it's the reference or the best, it's just one way of doing it, so we're going to start with that as our baseline. We're going to put that one down and look now at the SS3602 from Sparkos Labs. Looking at the SS3602, they're a much more no-frills design. It's a couple of circuit boards sandwiched on top of one another, and then with the 8-pin plug on the bottom. It's kind of fun being able to see the circuitry on the SS3602, but there's absolutely nothing you'd want to be touching there. They're all teeny, tiny surface mount devices. By not having any sort of housing on these, it means that the SS3602 is a very, very compact op amp, but it's got an ever so slightly larger footprint than something like the V6 Vivids. So you do need to be aware these take up a little bit more space in terms of its footprint area than something like the Burson. So they're going to work better where vertical space is limited, but you do need to be aware of horizontal space. As for aligning these, when you look at the SS3602, there's two ways of knowing which way to align it. On the bottom, you can actually see the notch in the plug section with the 8 pins. Or if you look at the top, there's a small little gold corner. That's the other marker, and you point the gold piece towards the end of the socket with the cutout. So both the SS3602 and the Burson V6 Vivid make it very easy to align them properly, but you always need to check, and I would say double check, before you go and plug them in and switch on a device. Failing to do so could kill your op amp and or your device, or both, and potentially your headphones as you plug them in. So do make sure you get it right before you switch on. It's pretty low risk if you're careful, but it is a potential way to blow up expensive equipment. And so with that out of the way, let's now have a look at the Staccato op amp. These things are pretty beastie. As you can see here straight away, it's a lot bulkier of a design, and it's got a really interesting setup. As I said at the beginning, there are different variants of the Staccato. They all work the same way, they're all the same circuitry, but there's a couple of heat sinks used on the Staccatos, and depending on how you have them arranged, will change how these are going to fit into a particular device. The version that I have here has the two heat sinks kind of facing inwards towards one another with a small gap for some airflow. And what that means is that this is both a wide op amp, but also a relatively tall op amp. It's actually about the same height as the Burson, but it's also wider than either the Burson or the Sparkos. So this is an op amp where you have to be careful to make sure you can actually fit it before you go down that path. Beyond that, and by appearance only, it looks to be another really well made op amp. So all three of these are priced roughly in the same ballpark. They all provide roughly the same performance in a general sense. And so it's going to come down a lot to which sound you like rather than which one of these is definitively better. And that's really what this review is all about, is letting you know which one has which tonal character so you can choose between them. Because I can't stress enough that there's not one of these op amps which is definitively better than the other in all situations. It's going to come down to where you're using it, both in terms of the device, but also the stage of the device. We'll talk about that in a moment. And then there's also the question of what sort of sound you're looking for. Each of these has its own sonic character, but they all perform very, very well. And so I'm going to start off talking to you about how each one of them sounds, what its sonic character is, and then we're going to talk about how each of them sounds in the various stages of the Burson Soloist 3XP amplifier and the Burson Composer DAC. The reason I'm using these is they're a particularly convenient product for op-amp rolling, but you can definitely apply what I'm about to say to other products as well, on the proviso that A, it has swappable op-amps, and B, it will physically fit the various op-amps we're talking about. The final piece of the puzzle though is I can't guarantee 100% that the performance will be identical with your particular device, unless it's one of these two I'm talking about specifically. I can give you a good sense, but you will find variation from one device to the next. So if you were able to put something like the SS3602 into a topping D50S, it might perform a little bit differently to how I'm describing it in the 3XP or the Composer here. So do take that into account. The sonic characteristics should be fairly transferable, but what that means in the context of your device can vary. And now with that out of the way, let me tell you how I did this testing. The first part of my setup was to try to get a baseline reference point by which to compare all of these. And without giving the game away too much, the way I did that was I tested them all in the Burson Soloist 3XP in the input stage. And the reason I'm specifying the input stage is that you've got two different places you can put a pair of these op amps within the Soloist 3XP. You've got the volume control and you've got the input stage. And so all of what I'm about to tell you is based on the input stage initially. I started off with the V6 Vivids in place as the baseline, and I was listening using the Mesa Elites. The track I used for all of these comparisons was Junkie Doll by Mark Knopfler. The final thing I should mention, and unfortunately this is a little bit of a spoiler, I was using the SS3602 op amps in the volume stage, and the reason I say that is because it does change the tonality a little bit of the overall amp. I'll get to that soon, but to me it was the most neutral and clean starting point for all of this comparison. So we've got SS3602s in the volume and V6 Vivids in the gain stage or the input stage, and we're listening to Junkie Doll by Mark Knopfler. What I heard with the V6 Vivids as my baseline reference was a tonality that was rich and smooth as it should be. There was plenty of clarity through the track. Things like the hi-hat and the mandolin strums were really nicely defined. There was a good sense of attack and clarity, but nothing overdone. I could hear the texture and fine details of Mark Knopfler's fingerwork on the guitar, but the guitar itself still had a sense of richness and smoothness, again as it should. The vocals were well focused in the mix, and the bass was present and clean, but not overly remarkable. All in all, I'd say that that setup was giving a really normal, neutral, natural type of sound. Nothing enhanced, nothing pulled back, everything just really well placed. And so that was my baseline starting point with the combination of the SS3602 and the V6 Vivid. The next step was to swap out the Vivids and go with SS3602s throughout the amplifier, and then see what difference that made to the tonality. Still listening to the same track, what I found was that everything was now overall even smoother. The vocals were brought forward a little bit more, so things became a bit more intimate, but I felt like the image was also a little bit sharper, more defined. I know it's a bit of a hyperbole to say it was holographic, but it certainly tended more in that direction. I felt like the vocal was more defined in space overall, despite being closer to me. That did come at the cost of some treble detail. Whether that's better or worse for you is a whole nother question, but certainly it felt like the treble was being smoothed off a little bit. And overall what that resulted in was a sound from the amp that was a bit less energetic, a little bit less exciting, but very, very smooth and very non-fatiguing. It didn't get rich or slow or completely rolled off or anything like that, but it definitely had a more relaxed, less energetic sound, and some people are going to like that, some people are not going to like that. Something else that I noticed was due to the combination of having that more smooth treble and also a more intimate presentation, the end result was I felt like sounds were a bit less separated. Probably because everything was closer together, there was less space between everything. Again, it wasn't bad, it wasn't congested, but that was a point of difference between the V6 Vivids and the Sparkos SS3602. And so based on that, what I would say is that the V6 Vivids are a slightly brighter and slightly more energetic sounding op-amp than something like the SS3602. The SS3602 produces a sharper image, but in a smaller sense of space and with a smoother, slightly more laid-back overall sound. Both are excellent, and a lot of it's going to come down to where you're putting them as to which one's better or worse, and I'll give you some specific examples of that in just a little while. Before we get there though, let's swap out the SS3602 and hear what happens when we go to the staccatos. Now the first thing I noticed was the staccatos only just fit inside the 3XP. It was a really close call, but they did make it. The sound from the staccatos is more like the V6 Vivids than it is like the SS3602, but they're still different. I felt like the staccatos brought a bit more sense of space to the soundstage, but they did so by pulling back on the mid-range and making things come across a little bit more V-shaped. It was like the mids were pushed away a little bit, and the treble and the bass were both lifted slightly. So things like that mandolin strumming and the fingerwork on the guitar and the hi-hats, all of that had a bit more energy than it did with the V6 Vivids. But the vocals, the guitar work, the richness of the guitar work that was all pulled back a little bit. So the overall mid-range got a bit drier, some might say a bit more neutral, maybe it's more analytical, but it's definitely less rich than something like the V6 Vivid. Again, I'm not saying that's better or worse, it's for you to decide what you like better. Overall, the staccatos produce a sound that comes across very clean and very dynamic. So if we were to plot these on some sort of continuum, if you had dynamic and kind of resolving and clean, maybe a little bit analytical, you'd put the staccatos in this direction. You'd probably put the V6 Vivids just on the left-hand side of middle as well. In other words, they're slightly more dynamic than maybe is truly neutral. And then you'd put the SS3602 either dead central and neutral, or probably just a little tiny bit towards the warm and maybe very slightly laid-back sound. But only just. None of these stray drastically away from that center point of what I would consider to be natural and neutral, but certainly the SS3602 tilts a little bit more towards the laid back and relaxed side of things, and the staccatos tilt a little bit more towards the dynamic and slightly analytical side of things. And so from there it's about deciding what you think your system would sound better with. More dynamics, more balance, more smoothness and more richness, that's all for you to decide. What I'm going to try to do to help clarify that for you though is now talk about my experiments using all of these op amps in different combinations within the Burson Soloist 3XP. And I'm not going to try and go through every single possible combination you could try because that would take forever. What I'm going to tell you instead is a couple of things that I really liked and a couple of things that maybe didn't go so well. For most of my testing of the specific combinations in these two devices, I was playing around listening to Take Me Home by Phil Collins, the live recording in this case, and the first thing I tried was having the Soloist 3XP in its fully stock form. And what that means is that you would have a pair of V6 Vivids just here where you can see some, and then another pair of V6 Vivids just here where the Sparkos are. As I said before, this is the volume stage and this is the input gain stage. Using all V6 Vivids in the Soloist, which is how it arrives, I find the sound really good, but there's maybe just a little bit too much emphasis on the very upper treble. It adds a bit of air and a bit of sense of clarity to the sound, but it can throw the tonality off just a little tiny bit from what I consider completely natural. Flipping over to having SS3602s from Sparkos in all four slots, that swung things in the other direction and brought a sense of weight and richness to the sound. It made the bass a bit punchier and a bit fuller. It made Phil Collins' vocals a bit more present and solid. But at the same time, for me, it went a little bit too far into the thickness and the richness, which is not what I personally want from the Soloist. But keep in mind, I also tend to listen to headphones that have a slightly more warm and rich sound to start with because that's my preference. And so then I played around with the SS3602 in the volume stage, and then the SS3602 in the input stage, with the V6 Vivids in the other one in each case. And it made for a really interesting mixture of sounds. What I found was that having the V6 Vivids in the volume and the Sparkos in the input stage was okay, but it wasn't my favourite. Funnily enough, just flipping where they were placed, but still having the SS3602s in one slot and the V6 Vivids in the other, landed for me on what I think is the perfect sound from the Soloist. The SS3602s in the volume stage bring a sense of weight and presence to some of the lower registers. They also take away that slightly unnatural tonality that can creep into the treble, and then having the V6 Vivids take care of the gain meant that you still get a nice sense of air and detail and energy coming from the Soloist. The overall combination, to me, provides a more focused image but still a great sense of space. It provides a better sense of weight and presence in things like vocals and mid-range instruments, and that carries down into the bass, things like bass guitars, kick basses from the drums. All those sorts of things have a better sense of presence and weight in the mix, but there's still excellent clarity and space in the soundstage thanks to those V6 Vivids. And this is really where the magic of op-amp rolling comes into play. It's often about the combination of op-amps you use rather than one individual brand. So as I said before, if you use all Sparkos op-amps in the Soloist, this is the SS3602 at least, I do find that it goes too far into richness and thickness because the overall design of the Soloist was not made for them. Each component in an amp, over and above the op-amps, has its own sound characteristic. And what that means is that the engineers over at Burson have probably chosen some of the componentry in the Soloist to suit the V6 Vivid. And that's where I found that keeping a pair of V6 Vivids, as it happens in the input stage, helped to balance off the benefits of the Vivids with the benefits of the SS3602. For the record, it is worth noting that you should always take care, and you are taking a level of responsibility for your own device when you're rolling op-amps, because as I mentioned before, there is a chance of inserting op-amps the wrong way, but on top of that, there are very rare occasions where op-amp rolling does lead to device failure. I'm not sure the reasons why it happens, but I have heard stories online. So do be aware, if you're doing this, there's a couple of things you need to do. First and foremost, I would say always test an amp when you first start op-amp rolling. Test it with a cheap, disposable pair of headphones. What I mean by disposable, not that you can buy disposable headphones, my point is a pair that you don't mind if it gets destroyed. Grab a cheap pair of portable headphones, something really basic, just to plug in and make sure it's working before you plug in something really expensive. Most amps that let you do op-amp rolling will have a degree of protection built in, and certainly the Burson Soloist and the Composer DAC have that sort of protection, but it doesn't mean that they're completely immune from damage. So do be aware if you're doing this, there is a very small level of risk and it's worth being careful. And I cannot stress enough, always check and double check the alignment of the op-amp before you plug it in, after you plug it in, and before you switch on the device. That's going to be the easiest way for you to cause major damage to the op-amp, the device, and or your headphones, but it's very easy to fix just by taking some care. And so with that little disclaimer out of the way, let's now talk about my use of the staccatos in the Soloist 3XP, and I'm going to keep it pretty brief by saying that the staccatos brought a really fun, energetic, and lively sound to the 3XP, but I didn't like the way it sort of overdid some of the detail and dynamics at the expense of the mid-range weight and presence. The sound was beautiful, it was thoroughly enjoyable, but I was just missing out on a bit of presence and weight in the mids when using the staccatos in the Soloist. And so what that says to me is that if you have a device that maybe has a bit too much mid-range thickness and emphasis, the staccatos could be a magical fix. But if you've got a device that's already quite bright and clean, as the Soloist can be, not that it's overly bright, but it's got good treble energy in its stock form, the staccatos just go a tiny bit too far. And so for me, the final setup that I landed on, as you already kind of know, is the Sparkos SS3602 in the volume stage, and the Vivids, the V6 Vivids from Burson, in the input gain stage. Things are a bit different though when we start talking about the Composer. As you'll see here, and I've removed one of them for the demo, I've got the staccatos in the actual Composer now. And that's because when I tried the SS3602s in the composer, things got too rich and too thick. I tend to like my DACs pretty clean and neutral because I like to add any coloration, if I'm going to, further down the chain. The problem with adding too much coloration in the DAC stage is that you can never undo that. And so for me, adding the staccatos to the composer made for a wonderful, clean, crisp, articulate and dynamic sounding DAC. Once again, you do lose a little bit of mid-range weight with the staccatos in here, but what you get instead is a great sense of space and clarity and dynamics. When I combined that setup of the composer with the staccatos, that really dynamic, resolving, spacious sound with a slight lack of mid-range weight, when I paired that up with the Burson XP running the SS3602s and the V6 Vivids, that combination made for a wonderful upgrade of this overall stack. It's not going to transform them and take them to a whole different level of performance, but it's a great way to tweak the sound and get it closer to your personal preferences. One final thing to note if you're thinking about using the staccatos in the composer should you have one, and I think this goes for the conductor as well, which is the all-in-one amplifier and DAC unit, is that they're a really, really tight fit. The op amps in here, the staccato ones, are literally bumping up against one another when put into the amplifier. So you do need to be really careful that you can fit these in. You want to make sure you're buying the right particular orientation of these, and there may actually be an orientation that works better than the one that I've got, but it's worth checking that out. Have a chat to the people at Staccato before you buy if you're unsure, and then when you get them, make sure you orient them correctly, pop them in there, and just be careful as you go if they are sitting close together. You don't want to bend the pins, you don't want to damage the op amps in the process, so do take some care. Once they're in though, the end result in my opinion is a wonderfully dynamic, clean and spacious sound. And so just to summarize things and pull it all together now, if you happen to be running the same stack as I'm talking about here, then having all staccatos in the composer, the DAC, and then running the SS3602 and the V6 Vivid in the amp, in my opinion, makes for a magical setup. If though you're only running the composer with some other type of amp, what I think you need to do instead is have a think about what sort of sound tweak you want. Do you want a more dynamic sound with a bit less mid-range weight? Then go for the staccatos. Do you need something that's a bit richer and lusher and smoother? In that case, go for the Sparkos SS3602. Do things sound exactly how you like? Leave it with the V6 Vivids. And then the same goes with the Soloist 3XP if you're running it with a different DAC to the composer. Perhaps your DAC is really clean, resolving and analytical. If that's the case, you might like SS3602s in all four sockets. Maybe your DAC is rich and thick, maybe something like the Aries 2 from Denafrips that is quite a lush and rich DAC. In that case, you may find the staccatos are your preferred choice in the Soloist. Or maybe you buy one pair of staccatos and you keep the V6 Vivid and you have a bit of a play and see which one fits well where. For the record, I did try a pair of staccatos and the V6 Vivids, swapping them around, but there wasn't a particular combination there that I felt was in any way preferable to the SS3602 and the V6 Vivids, which is why I've only focused on those. So as you can see, this is a game of mixing, matching, comparing, seeing what you like, working out what your preferences are, and going with that. There is no such thing as right and wrong. Part of the fun is in the experimentation, the trial and error, and I haven't even talked about the fact that each of these combinations is also going to be interacting with the headphones you're using it with. So again, if you have a really analytical pair of headphones that you're attached to and they're not going anywhere, you might choose to tune the amplifier and or the DAC to suit those headphones. In my case, I was trying to tune these to suit any headphone, but that was my personal approach. You might do it differently. And so with all that in mind, I hope this roundup has provided for you some clarity on the pros and cons of each of these op amps. Because as you can clearly see, there's no such thing as one right or one wrong option. Don't be afraid to experiment and roll different combinations through different devices or different sockets within the Soloist 3XP, be it the volume stage is one pair or the input stage is another. Explore, play, and enjoy the journey. Hopefully you've found this review useful and helpful. Obviously I haven't given any definitive answers because there kind of aren't any in this game, but if you're interested in any of the op amps I've talked about here, I'll put links down below through to Staccato, through to Sparkos Labs, and through to Burson, where you can pick up the op amps for yourself. And of course, there are also other op amps on the market, so these are not the only op amps you can choose from. They're just the 3 sets that I happen to have here. And on that note, I want to say a huge thanks to Staccato, to Sparkos Labs, and to Burson for making this review possible. They've all contributed and helped in different ways, but this review wouldn't be happening without them. There's no kickbacks or affiliates though, so any purchases you make are just a way of saying thank you. There's no benefit to me and the channel. So I hope you found this review useful. Hopefully I haven't provided too many variables and confused you totally at this point. If I have, take a deep breath, choose one option to start with, and just go slowly and explore your own way through this. For now though, I'll leave you to the music, so happy op amp rolling, happy listening, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.